Black history is not a separate story, but a foundational force that shaped America's economy, culture, and political systems from the very beginning, long before the United States became a nation. The labor, knowledge, and resilience of African and African American people were already shaping the land, the economy, and the society that would emerge. Their contributions were not optional or secondary. They were essential to the country's survival and growth. From the earliest colonial settlements, black labor-powered agriculture, built ports and roads, and sustained industries that generated enormous wealth. At the same time, black culture through language, music, craftsmanship, and spiritual traditions quietly influenced what America would come to sound like, feel like, and believe. Even under the harshest conditions, black communities preserved identity, passed down knowledge, and created new forms of expression that continue to define American culture today. Politically, black history shaped America through struggle. Laws were written to control black bodies, but those same systems sparked resistance, organizing, and demands for freedom that forced the nation to confront its own contradictions. Every debate about liberty, citizenship, labor, and justice has been shaped, in some way, by the presence and resistance of black Americans. This story is not only about suffering, it is about survival, creativity, and transformation. It is about people who, despite being denied rights and recognition, helped build the very foundations of the nation while constantly pushing it to live up to its ideals. If you want to understand America, its past, its present, and its future, you cannot separate it from black history. In this series, we will uncover the untold stories that shaped the country in ways rarely taught or fully acknowledged. If you find this kind of storytelling meaningful, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we explore these powerful chapters of history together. The transatlantic slave trade did not emerge as an isolated chapter, separate from the foundations of America described earlier, but as a system that locked those foundations into place and determined who would benefit from them and who would be excluded. As black labor built fields, ports, and cities, the transatlantic trade transformed human lives into commodities and wove racial slavery into the economic logic of the colonies. What began as a network of ships crossing the Atlantic soon became a structure that defined how wealth was created, how work was valued, and how racial hierarchy was enforced in early America. Across the ocean, African societies were drawn into a global system driven by demand, profit, and expansion. Millions were forced into voyages that reshaped not only their own lives, but the future of entire continents. When they arrived in the Americas, their labor became the engine of agricultural economies built on crops such as sugar, tobacco, rice, and cotton. These industries did more than enrich individual plantation owners. They fueled international trade, strengthened colonial governments, and helped lay the groundwork for modern capitalism. The wealth generated through enslaved labor flowed into banks, shipping companies, and political institutions, quietly shaping the economic foundations of the nation. At the same time, this system demanded a new way of thinking about human difference. To justify perpetual enslavement, racial categories were hardened into law, custom, and belief. Skin color became a marker used to assign status, opportunity, and power. Embedding inequality into everyday life, labor was no longer simply work. It was tied to race, inherited across generations, and protected by legal frameworks designed to preserve control. In this way, the transatlantic slave trade did more than supply workers. It created a racial order that structured society from top to bottom. Yet even within this oppressive system, the people caught inside it were never passive. Enslaved Africans carried knowledge, skills, and cultural memory across the ocean, reshaping the Americas in ways often overlooked. They adapted agricultural techniques, preserved languages and traditions, and built communities under constant pressure. Acts of resistance, both subtle and open, challenged the idea that domination was total or unchanging. These actions did not dismantle the system overnight, but they exposed its fragility and its dependence on force. The impact of the transatlantic slave trade extended far beyond the era in which it operated. Its legacy shaped patterns of land ownership, labor exploitation, and political power that persisted long after legal slavery ended. The racial hierarchy it created influenced who could vote, who could own property, and whose lives were valued by institutions meant to serve the public. Even debates about freedom and equality in early America were framed against the reality of a society built on racialized labor. Understanding this system reveals how deeply connected Black history is to the broader American story. The same trade that generated immense wealth also planted divisions that would define the nation's struggles for generations. By tracing these connections, the story of the transatlantic slave trade becomes not only a history of exploitation, but a key to understanding how America was formed, how its contradictions emerged, and why the echoes of this system continue to shape the present. Within the system created by the transatlantic slave trade, where labor, wealth, and racial hierarchy were tightly controlled, enslaved Africans were expected to exist only as workers, stripped of identity and connection. Yet the reality was far more complex. In the spaces between labor and surveillance, they built lives that defied the system's intentions. Families were formed under conditions designed to prevent permanence. Love persisted where separation was common, and culture survived in places where it was meant to disappear. These acts, though often quiet, became powerful forms of resistance that shaped the human story behind the economic foundations already described. Family life among enslaved Africans rarely followed the stability that freedom allows. Yet bonds were created and fiercely protected. Parents taught children values, survival skills, and a sense of belonging, even when the threat of separation loomed constantly. Kinship extended beyond bloodlines, forming networks of care that helped individuals endure loss and uncertainty. In these relationships, enslaved people asserted their humanity in a world that denied it, proving that family could exist even when the system tried to reduce people to labor alone. Culture became another space of survival and defiance. Songs carried memory and meaning, blending African rhythms with new experiences in the Americas. Stories passed down at night preserved history, moral lessons, and hope. Spiritual practices adapted, drawing strength from faith while offering moments of collective expression and comfort. Language, foodways, and craftsmanship evolved through adaptation, shaping regional cultures that would later be recognized as distinctly American. These traditions were not frozen in time. They changed and grew, reflecting both loss and resilience. And they quietly reshaped the society around them. Resistance took many forms, not all of them visible to those in power. Some resisted through work slowdowns, subtle acts of non-compliance, or maintaining cultural practices that laws and customs sought to erase. Others resisted more openly, through escape, organized defiance, or cooperation with broader movements for freedom. Even survival itself, in a system that depended on exhaustion and fear, became an act of resistance. Every preserved tradition, every family bond, and every shared story challenged the idea that control was complete. Violence was a constant presence, shaping daily life and reinforcing the structures of racial slavery. Yet it never fully achieved its goal. Instead of destroying identity, it revealed the limits of domination. Enslaved Africans adapted, learned, and found ways to endure, creating spaces of meaning within confinement. These experiences did not erase suffering, but they demonstrate that Black history is not defined solely by oppression. It is also defined by agency. creativity, and persistence. This continuity of family, culture, and resistance connects directly to the broader American story already unfolding. The same people whose labor built wealth and whose exploitation shaped racial hierarchies also laid the cultural and moral groundwork for future generations. Their survival strategies influenced music, language, religious life, and community structures that continue to shape American society today. By understanding these lived experiences, the story moves beyond systems and structures and returns to the human lives that sustained them, revealing how endurance and resistance became central forces in the making of America. As families and cultural traditions took shape under enslavement, the experiences of black women and children revealed another layer of the system's cruelty and complexity. Their lives were shaped by the same forces of labor and racial control already described, yet the burdens they carried were often heavier and more personal. Black women were expected to sustain households, endure relentless work, and bear children whose futures were never secure, while black children grew up knowing that family bonds could be broken at any moment. Within this reality, survival required constant adaptation, and resistance often emerged in forms that history has struggled to fully acknowledge. Black women stood at the center of enslaved communities, holding together fragile family networks under extraordinary pressure. They worked in fields, kitchens, workshops, and homes, performing labor that sustained both plantation life and domestic order. At the same time, they were caretakers, healers, and teachers, passing down knowledge that helped families endure. Their bodies were treated as resources by a system that denied them autonomy, yet their inner lives remained their own. Through faith, memory, and quiet defense, they preserved a sense of self that laws and customs could not erase. Children experienced enslavement not as a distant concept, but as the environment in which they learned to walk, speak, and understand the world. Childhood was shaped by labor expectations, uncertainty, and early exposure to loss. Yet even in these conditions, children absorbed culture through song, story, and shared experience. Elders taught them lessons about identity and survival, preparing them for a future defined by obstacles they did not choose. The resilience of these children was not accidental. It was cultivated by communities determined to protect hope wherever possible. Family separation cast a long shadow over daily life. Parents lived with the constant fear that loved ones could be taken away, while children learned early that stability was fragile. In response, extended families formed, creating networks of care that crossed bloodlines. These relationships offered emotional support and continuity, reinforcing the idea that family could be defined by commitment rather than law. In this way, black women and children reshaped kinship itself, building systems of belonging that outlasted the conditions that created them. Resistance, for women and children, often took subtle and enduring forms. Women resisted by protecting their children's sense of identity, by teaching songs and stories that affirmed worth, and by sustaining communal bonds that made isolation impossible. Children resisted simply by growing, learning, and carrying memory forward. Their existence challenged a system that relied on erasure, reminding future generations that survival itself could be an act of defiance. These forms of resistance rarely appeared in official records, yet they were essential to the endurance of black communities. The experiences of black women and children connect directly to the broader patterns already shaping America. The same system that generated wealth and enforced racial hierarchy relied on their labor, their reproduction, and their endurance, yet it also underestimated their influence. Through care, teaching, and persistence, they laid foundations for cultural continuity and collective strength. Their stories reveal that resistance was not only a matter of escape or confrontation, but also of nurturing life in conditions designed to suppress it. By centering these experiences, the narrative of Black history becomes more complete. It moves beyond abstract systems and returns to the people who lived within them, showing how survival was sustained through compassion, memory, and quiet courage. Black women and children were not only affected by history, they shaped it, ensuring that even in the most restrictive circumstances, humanity endured and the future remained possible. As families were formed, cultures preserved, and women and children carried the weight of survival, resistance emerged as a constant presence rather than an occasional response. It did not begin on land, nor did it wait for organized movements to take shape. Resistance traveled across the ocean itself, born in the confined spaces of ships where captivity first took hold. In these moments, resistance was not abstract or symbolic, it was immediate, dangerous, and rooted in the refusal to accept a life defined entirely by control. Aboard slave ships, acts of defiance disrupted the system at its most vulnerable point. Captives communicated across language barriers, shared knowledge, and seized moments when discipline weakened. These uprisings were fueled by a shared understanding that survival without freedom was never guaranteed. Even when such efforts failed, they exposed the reality that the system depended on constant force and fear to function. Resistance at sea revealed that domination was neither natural nor uncontested, but something that had to be imposed again and again. On land, resistance adapted to new conditions. Maroon communities formed in remote forests, swamps, and mountains, where escaped individuals built settlements beyond the reach of colonial authority. These communities were not temporary refuges. They were living alternatives to the world of enslavement. Drawing on African traditions and local knowledge, Maroons established systems of governance, defense, and trade. Their existence challenged the assumption that slavery was permanent or unavoidable, demonstrating that freedom could be claimed and defended, even in hostile environments. The presence of Maroon communities also reshaped the balance of power. Plantation owners and colonial governments recognized them as threats, not because of their size, but because of what they represented. Each successful escape weakened the illusion of total control and inspired others to imagine different possibilities. Resistance, in this sense, spread not only through action but through example, carried by stories whispered across fields and shared in secret gatherings. Over time, resistance became more organized, weaving itself into networks that spanned regions and generations. The Underground Railroad emerged from this long tradition, built not on a single route or leader, but on trust, cooperation, and courage. Enslaved individuals relied on free black communities, sympathetic allies, and their own determination to move through a landscape shaped by danger. Each journey required careful planning and an understanding of how to navigate both physical, terrain and social boundaries. What made these efforts remarkable was not only their success, but their persistence. Resistance continued despite severe consequences and overwhelming odds. It adapted to new laws, new forms of surveillance, and new attempts at suppression. This endurance reveals that the fight against slavery was never passive or limited to a few dramatic moments. It was a sustained struggle, carried forward by countless individuals whose names rarely appear in official records but whose actions shaped history nonetheless. These acts of resistance connect directly to the lives already described, to families protecting one another, to women nurturing resilience, and to children learning that survival could include hope. Resistance was woven into daily life, shaping decisions both large and small. It influenced how communities formed, how culture was preserved, and how future generations understood freedom. By recognizing resistance as constant rather than exceptional, the story of slavery shifts in important ways. It becomes not only a history of oppression, but also a history of determination and strategy. The struggle against slavery was shaped by people who refused to accept the limits placed upon them. who imagined freedom long before it was recognized by law. Their resistance did not simply challenge the system, it helped dismantle it, step by step, laying the groundwork for the ongoing pursuit of justice that would follow. When slavery formally ended, it appeared to mark a turning point in the long struggle that had unfolded through resistance, survival, and sacrifice. Yet for those who had endured generations of captivity, freedom arrived with conditions that quickly revealed its limits. The systems that had depended on racial control did not disappear. They adapted. In place of chains came laws, contracts, and institutions designed to preserve the same hierarchy that slavery had enforced, reshaping domination into forms that appeared legal, orderly, and permanent. In the aftermath of emancipation, newly freed black communities sought what freedom had always promised: the ability to work for themselves, reunite families, gain education, and participate fully in civic life. For a brief moment, possibilities expanded, schools were built, communities organized, and political participation began to take root. This fragile progress, however, was met with resistance from those determined to restore the old order. Black codes emerged as one of the first tools of control, regulating movement, labor, and behavior in ways that made freedom conditional. These laws limited where black people could live, how they could work, and even whether they could remain in one place without proof of employment. Labor remained at the center of this new system. Convict leasing transformed the criminal justice system into a mechanism for forced labor, drawing directly from the logic of slavery. Minor accusations and selective enforcement funneled black men, and sometimes women and children, into prisons where their labor was rented out to private interests. This system blurred the line between punishment and profit, allowing industries to benefit from controlled labor while claiming legal authority. For those trapped within it, freedom existed only in name, as daily life mirrored the exploitation that emancipation was supposed to end. As decades passed, Jim Crow laws solidified racial separation into every aspect of public life. Education, transportation, housing, and employment were divided by race, reinforcing inequality through policy rather than overt ownership. These laws were not merely social customs. They were enforced by institutions that shaped opportunity and belonging. The promise of equal citizenship remained distant, constrained by barriers designed to appear neutral while producing deeply unequal outcomes. In this environment, progress required constant negotiation, resilience, and adaptation. Despite these obstacles, black communities continued the patterns of resistance that had defined earlier generations. Families emphasized education as a path forward. Churches and mutual aid organizations became centers of support, and cultural expression flourished as a means of preserving identity and dignity. These efforts echoed the strategies developed under slavery, where survival depended on cooperation, memory, and collective strength. The struggle had changed form, but its essence remained the same. This period reveals a critical truth about American history. The end of slavery did not dismantle the structures that benefited from racial hierarchy. Instead, those structures evolved, embedding inequality into law and custom while claiming progress. Understanding this continuity connects directly to the earlier stories of resistance, family, and endurance. The same forces that shaped life under slavery continue to influence freedom's limits, demonstrating that liberation was not a single event but a contested process. By tracing this transition, the narrative moves beyond simple timelines and into the lived reality of freedom constrained. It shows how systems of control survived by reinventing themselves and how black communities, drawing on generations of resilience, continued to push against those boundaries. This chapter of history is not only about restriction. It is about the persistence of hope and the determination to claim rights that had long been denied. In recognizing these patterns, the story of Black history remains unified, revealing how past struggles informed future movements and how the pursuit of true freedom continued long after slavery's legal end. As systems of control evolved after the end of slavery, Black Americans continued to shape the nation in ways that were both essential and often unrecognized. Their labor did not end with emancipation, nor did their influence fade as new laws and customs attempted to limit opportunity. Instead, Black men and women remained central to the building of the United States, contributing to its physical foundations, its economic growth, its defense, and its cultural identity, even as access to the rewards of that labor remained deeply unequal. Across the countryside and in growing cities, Black workers laid roads, cleared land, and constructed railways that connected regions and fueled expansion. In agriculture, generations of knowledge transformed soil into sustenance, sustaining industries that fed both domestic markets and international trade. These contributions were not simply manual tasks. They reflected expertise passed down through families and communities, adapting to new technologies and conditions over time. Yet ownership of land, profit, and political power rarely followed the labor that created them, reinforcing a pattern where contribution and recognition remained disconnected. Military service offered another path through which Black Americans shaped the nation. From early conflicts through major wars, they served in roles that demanded discipline, courage, and sacrifice. Participation in the armed forces became a way to claim belonging and assert citizenship, even when equal treatment was denied. Their service strengthened national defense and expanded the meaning of patriotism, challenging narrow definitions of who could embody the nation's ideals. Still, the benefits promised to those who served were often delayed or withheld, reflecting broader patterns of exclusion. Cultural influence emerged as one of the most enduring contributions. Music, language, art, and storytelling developed within Black communities and gradually reshaped American identity. These expressions drew from African traditions, experiences of survival, and ongoing struggles for dignity, creating forms that resonated far beyond their origins. Over time, these cultural innovations became central to what the world recognizes as American culture, even when the people who created them were marginalized. Creativity became both a means of expression and a quiet assertion of presence in a society that often sought to overlook Black voices. Education and professional life also reflected this tension between contribution and exclusion. Black teachers, scholars, and professionals built institutions that served their communities when access to mainstream systems was restricted. These efforts fostered leadership, preserved history, and prepared future generations to navigate a world shaped by inequality. Progress was often incremental and contested, yet each step forward built upon the resilience developed through earlier struggles. This pattern connects directly to the histories already explored, where labor under slavery, resistance, and survival shaped the nation's foundations. The continuity is clear. Black Americans were never absent from the American story. Even when recognition was withheld, their work sustained industries, defended the nation, and defined its cultural character, while barriers limited access to wealth, security, and influence. Understanding this contradiction deepens the narrative of Black history as integral rather than peripheral. It reveals how the nation's growth depended on contributions that were simultaneously celebrated in outcome and denied in credit. By acknowledging these realities, the story moves closer to truth, recognizing that America's strength was built not only through ideals of freedom and opportunity, but through the labor and creativity of those who were excluded from fully enjoying them. As Black communities built institutions, created wealth, and shaped culture despite exclusion, another pattern emerged alongside progress, one designed to halt it. whenever black success challenged the established order. Violence was often used not only to punish individuals but to erase entire communities and silence their stories. These events were not random outbreaks of chaos. They followed a clear logic rooted in fear of black independence, political power, and economic self-sufficiency. Across the country, thriving black towns and neighborhoods became targets once they demonstrated what freedom and opportunity could look like when allowed to take root. These communities built businesses, schools, newspapers, and civic organizations, creating networks of support that mirrored the very ideals America claimed to value. Their success stood as visible proof that generations of oppression had not broken ambition or capability. For those invested in maintaining racial hierarchy, this visibility became a threat. Violence was used as a tool to dismantle that threat. Entire neighborhoods were attacked, homes and businesses destroyed, and residents driven away. The aftermath often left no path to return, as land was seized. Records disappeared, and survivors were denied justice. These acts were rarely followed by accountability, reinforcing the message that black prosperity could be taken without consequence. The destruction served not only to eliminate wealth but to disrupt continuity, breaking the link between generations that had worked to build something lasting. Lynchings functioned within this same system of control, extending fear into everyday life. They were intended to send a warning far beyond the individual targeted, signaling the limits of ambition and resistance. The impact reached families, schools, and workplaces, shaping decisions about where it was safe to live, work, or speak. Silence became a survival strategy, and memory itself was forced underground. Over time, the absence of official recognition allowed these events to fade from public narratives, even as their effects remained deeply embedded in communities. The erasure of memory became as powerful as the violence itself. Stories were excluded from textbooks, public commemorations, and historical records, leaving gaps that distorted the national story. Survivors carried these histories privately, passing them down through families and local traditions. This preservation echoed earlier forms of resistance, where culture and storytelling protected truth when institutions failed to do so. Memory became a quiet form of defense, ensuring that what was lost would not be forgotten entirely. These acts of suppression connect directly to the broader patterns already traced. From enslavement and resistance to exclusion after emancipation, each time Black Americans carved out space for autonomy, the response revealed how fragile freedom remained. Violence was not separate from progress. It followed it, shaping where growth was allowed and where it was forcefully stopped. Understanding this relationship challenges the idea that advancement moved steadily forward, instead revealing a cycle of achievement met by backlash. Yet even in the face of destruction, resilience persisted. Communities rebuilt in new places, adapted strategies, and continued to pursue education, ownership, and political participation. Cultural expression carried memory forward, transforming loss into testimony and warning. The survival of these stories demonstrates that while violence aimed to erase both people and their achievements, it never fully succeeded. By acknowledging these chapters, the narrative of Black history becomes more complete and more honest. It shows how success was repeatedly contested and how memory itself became a battleground. These events were not interruptions in the story. They were defining forces that shaped the present. Recognizing them does not dwell on tragedy alone, but affirms the determination of communities that refuse to disappear, preserving truth even when the nation tried to look away. After generations marked by survival, suppression, rebuilding, and memory, the movements for civil rights did not emerge from silence or sudden inspiration. They were the visible expression of struggles that had been unfolding quietly for centuries, shaped by lessons learned under slavery, sharpened by exclusion after emancipation, and sustained by communities that refused to surrender their humanity. What appeared to the wider nation as a breaking point was, for Black Americans, the continuation of a long and deliberate fight for dignity and belonging. Organizing began long before marches filled streets or speeches reached national audiences. It took place in churches where people gathered not only to worship, but to exchange information and plan collective action. It lived in schools that taught children history alongside survival, preparing them to understand both the promise and the limits of the world they inherited. Mutual aid societies, newspapers, and local leaders carried forward strategies developed under earlier systems of control, proving that resistance could be structured, patient, and deeply rooted. Each generation inherited both trauma and knowledge. Parents passed down warnings alongside hope, teaching children when to speak, when to move carefully, and when to stand firm. These lessons were shaped by lived experience, by memories of progress met with backlash, and by the understanding that change required endurance. The movements that later gained national attention were built on this foundation, drawing strength from networks that had already learned how to survive under pressure. Sacrifice was an unavoidable part of this process. Many who organized risked employment, safety, and social standing. Some faced intimidation simply for insisting on rights that were supposed to be guaranteed. Yet these risks were not taken blindly. Strategy guided action, informed by the failures and successes of the past. Non-violent protest. Legal challenges, economic boycotts, and voter education were chosen not out of simplicity, but out of careful calculation, shaped by an understanding of how power responded to pressure. The role of women and young people was especially significant, reflecting patterns established long before. They organized behind the scenes, sustained momentum, and often carried the emotional labor that kept movements alive during setbacks. Their leadership echoed earlier forms of resistance, where survival depended on adaptability and collective care. This continuity reveals that the civil rights era was not a departure from history, but a chapter deeply connected to everything that came before it. National recognition came slowly, often lagging behind local action. When change finally reached the federal level, it reflected years of groundwork laid by ordinary people whose names rarely entered textbooks. Laws shifted, barriers were challenged, and possibilities expanded. But these victories were never absolute. Each gain required defense, and each step forward revealed new forms of resistance from those invested in preserving inequality. The movements understood this reality, having seen similar patterns repeat across generations. Placing civil rights movements within this longer timeline changes how they are understood. They become not moments of sudden awakening, but the result of sustained effort shaped by memory, strategy, and resilience. This perspective honors those who organized quietly, who endured setbacks, and who believed in change even when evidence suggested otherwise. Their work connected past struggles to future possibilities, carrying forward a vision of freedom that had been imagined long before it was acknowledged. By recognizing this continuity, the story remains unified, revealing how resistance evolved rather than appeared. The civil rights movement stand as proof that history is shaped not only by moments of visibility, but by generations of persistence that made those moments possible. Modern inequality, cultural influence, and social movements do not exist in isolation. They are the living echoes of the history that has unfolded across generations. The patterns seen today in wealth gaps, access to education, health outcomes, and political power can be traced directly to systems built long ago and reshaped rather than removed over time. Understanding this continuity does not reduce the present to the past, but it reveals how deeply the past still shapes the choices, opportunities, and struggles that define American life. At the same time, Black cultural influence continues to shape the nation in powerful ways. Music, language, fashion, art, and storytelling rooted in Black experience remain central to how America expresses itself to the world. These cultural forms emerged from resilience and creativity forged under pressure, carrying history within them even when that history goes unspoken. They remind us that Black history is not only a record of hardship, but a source of innovation that has repeatedly renewed American culture and expanded its meaning. Modern social movements draw directly from this legacy. The strategies, language, and moral clarity seen today reflect lessons learned through centuries of organizing, resistance, and adaptation. They are shaped by the understanding that progress is neither guaranteed nor permanent, and that rights must be claimed, defended, and reimagined by each generation. These movements are not departures from American history. They are part of its ongoing story, rooted in the same pursuit of dignity and justice that defined earlier struggles. When Black history is treated as separate or optional, the broader story of America becomes incomplete. The nation's ideals of freedom, equality, and opportunity were tested, challenged, and expanded through Black experience. To understand how America became what it is today, and where it may go next, requires engaging honestly with this history in all its complexity. It asks us to see connections rather than isolated events, and to recognize how the past continues to shape the present. This story is not meant to assign blame or offer simple answers. It is meant to deepen understanding by acknowledging how Black history has shaped the nation's economy, culture, laws, and movements. We gain a clearer view of America itself. The goal is not to look backward in anger, but to look forward with insight, informed by the truth that history reveals. Thank you for spending this time with this story, and for listening with curiosity and openness. If this journey through history added perspective or meaning for you, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. By supporting this space, you help keep these stories alive and ensure that the conversations they inspire continue into the future.